Hey, welcome to the latest episode of the Voices of eCommerce. I'm John Drake, professor of Management Information Systems at East Carolina University. In this podcast, I interview the incredible people behind the scenes of eCommerce, the people that design, build, market, and run various online, mobile, and social initiatives. And now, on with the show.
Today's guest is Brian Amerige. Brian comes from California. I believe you spent most of your time from there, spending your childhood immersed in software development. I believe I saw on LinkedIn, or maybe it was your homepage, that you had created a firm in high school to build software for the Mac and iOS. And in fact, your company won the runner-up Apple Design Award in 2008. It sounds impressive. I know I've never done anything like that. After spending a few years at UC San Diego, Brian started work at Facebook, where he worked on the original Facebook app for the iOS, and then worked on a team designing Paper, which was a new interface for Facebook consumption, and continued working at Facebook on the core app UI and Facebook groups, and then left in 2018. And now Brian is co-founder and CEO of Thoughtful, a social platform for thoughtful content. So welcome to the show, Brian.
Thanks. Really excited to be here.
I appreciate it. So let's get right into Thoughtful, because this is an interesting new app. I've been using it now for a couple months, and it's growing on me. So I recently finished reading a book called Deep Work by Cal Newport. And in it, he differentiates between deep, immersive work and shallow, distracted work. And it occurred to me as I was working or using Thoughtful that this seems to be a similar differentiation in how you're building content platform, and that you want to be a deep, immersive consumption of content versus a shallow consumption of content. Would you consider that a fair comparison?
Yeah, I mean, there is that kind of distinction. I mean, we think about it in terms of enriching versus not enriching. I think that the background context for us is, we need ideas to flourish as human beings. Like the things that we think, the things that our conclusions we come to about all sorts of issues matter for the way our life goes. And the internet is something of a paradox today. We have 1,000 times more access to information than we've ever had before. But so much of it is junk and is clickbait. It's news that either doesn't matter, or if it does matter, it's usually not the right thing to us to be focusing on right now. It's just not a good use of our time. And so we're suffering from these endless feeds of content that is, it's interesting. But in the aggregate, it's not very good for us. And so, you see, I think people are starting to realize this over time. We've had social media for well over a decade now, coming in up on 2 decades in a certain sense. And so you're starting to see these efforts to distance ourselves from this kind of psychological experience that these platforms are creating for us. You see things like screen time from Apple, which is basically trying to guilt you into spending less time on your phone. On the more extreme side, you see things like digital detox, which is kind of this, I think, Cal Newport talks a little bit about this, but digital detox is basically this idea that like we should spend, long periods of time away from our phones. And there's this general culture, I think, that's setting us against our phones and against digital devices. And what we see is an opportunity to transform that relationship. Because I don't think the phone is the thing that should be demonized. I don't think the internet is the thing that should be demonized. It's the content that we have access to that's facilitated by these services. And so, we're trying to build a new kind of habitual content consumption experience that's actually good for our lives. The kind of thing that you look back on at the end of the day and you're like, I'm actually better for having spent that time on my phone. And so a lot of our users tell us that's something between significant in their lives to even life-changing. Because some of these ideas you can get are just going to totally transform, the way you go about making choices and living your life. And so, that's what we're focused on. We're focused on the enriching versus not enriching gap.
And so, as you're designing this enriching experience, what types of like features do you use to facilitate that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a whole bunch that we've actually gone through. Like you said, I spent a long time at Facebook. I was there for about 7 years. I sort of grew up in that culture, and I saw a lot of how newsfeed evolved and what the incentives and disincentives were in designing that kind of thing. And so there's a lot that we're doing actually very differently from the way Facebook works to facilitate this. A big part of what we're doing is helping people spend more time on long form content versus short form content. So a big part of what's happened is that on our phones, usually we're on Facebook or Twitter in 5 to 10 minute sessions many times a day, and we're generally doing it on smaller screens. And that's led to a real emphasis on shorter form content, things that you can finish in 5 to 10 minutes, things that don't necessarily require a huge cognitive load for you to actually get that kind of dopamine hit from consuming it. And so what we're trying to do is adapt the best content in the world for that context. And so one of the big features we have is Q. And Q is all about basically not just helping you get back to the content that you actually do want to spend time on, rather than continually focusing on what's new and what's happening right now, but breaking down that long form content into 5 to 10 minute sessions. And so one of the things we do across every type of content, whether it's video or audio or even articles, is we save your place in everything that you're working on. And so no matter when you come back to it, whether you have 5 minutes or an hour, you're going to jump right back to where you left off, and you can make progress that way. And it is unbelievable. If you look at something like, lectures on YouTube, for example, it is unbelievable how much of that kind of amazing content you can consume in 5 to 10 minute periods. If you have a service that's constantly putting it in front of you so that you can actually continue to make progress, and making it easy for you to do it in 10-minute sessions. So that's just one example, but there's a whole bunch there.
I want to go back and kind of do a comparison. I know you're most familiar with Facebook. I've spent some time there, but other social platforms, what is it about them that encourages this shallow or non-enriching approach to content, in your opinion?
Yeah, so it goes pretty deep. Facebook and you have to talk about these a little bit differently between Facebook and Twitter. So I can talk about both of them. In Facebook's case, Facebook is really designed to help you connect with your friends and family and the communities that you care about. That's really what the whole product is about. It's what the mission was for a long time. To make the world more open and connected. Today, it's to bring people closer together. And from that perspective, what Facebook is really about are those photos from your friend's wedding. They are the major life events. They are the sort of significant things that are happening, in the lives of the people that you care about. What's happened, though, is that, so that's what it's great at. Everything about Facebook is built for that. And so, you look at newsfeed, there's a ton of that kind of content. If you've got something like 250 friends on Facebook, there's a ton of that kind of content. And so it has to rank content and choose what's going to get your attention at the top of the newsfeed. And the best way to do that when you're talking about something like your wedding photos or life updates and things like that, the best way to do that is to look at the people you've engaged with most frequently in the past and the kinds of content that you found engaging, previously. And so it's basically ranked essentially by some combination of popularity and what gets you to click on stuff. And that model works really well for friend and family content. The problem is so much of what people are sharing on Facebook now, and Facebook has wanted this to happen for mostly for worse, but so much of the content is not that sort of content anymore. It's really about news. It's about what's going on in the world. It's about political issues. And if I regard that as intellectual content. These are about ideas. And if you take that mechanism of sorting things by popularity and what's going to get you to click on stuff, and you apply that to ideas, it's a disaster. You get clickbait, you get sensationalism, you get the craziest claims, the things that are going to provoke fear in you. That stuff is the stuff that that really motivates people to click on it and engage with. And it's really this really terrible cycle because when then Facebook starts seeing all this clickbait and sensationalism, this junk rise to the top, and that's also what prompts them to have such a kind of heavy-handed content policy these days, where they have a perspective on what's true, and you're not allowed to say things that are outside of that perspective, and you can get banned or shadow banned from Facebook, and your content can be moderated or throttled and things like that. And so there's a whole bunch of problems that come up because they start with this base of ranking by popularity and by engagement, and then but the platform gets infiltrated by ideas which are really dangerous if you sort of rank them that way. And so I think that's the root of it for Facebook. Twitter is sort of a different category. Twitter's purpose in the world is to show you what's happening now. I mean, that's kind of the one-liner for them, is like what's happening right now. And Twitter is very good at showing you what's happening right now. You can see that there are some, when it comes to intellectual content and people figuring out what they think is true or significant on a topic, the answer to what's happening right now, probably not super close to the best kind of content for you to be. It's not the best way for you to learn about anything. What's happening right now may be interesting because of its recency, but it's certainly not something that's conducive for you coming to rational, thoughtful conclusions on any particular issue. And so the root of it is really these platforms are not designed to be platforms for intellectual content. They're not designed to help your thinking. They're not designed to answer questions about complex and controversial issues in your life, and yet they're all we have, right? I mean, that kind of is the internet today. You've got Google, which has its own incredible set of problems on these issues, and you've got these social platforms, and that's part of what we see as the opportunity here. Is just like the internet has, it is a gold mine of amazing content. The problem is we just don't. The problem is the distribution piece of it. Like, how do you actually get people to have a habit of not wanting the sugar-like junk clickbait? And how do you actually find the good stuff in the ocean of garbage? And so that's what we're spending all of our time on, is trying to build an alternative that's really built for, a platform for ideas is a very difficult thing. And I don't think that it's really been attempted in a very serious way so far.
Yeah, I like that idea of platform of ideas. Now, you also mentioned that this is a social platform. So how does that fit into that picture?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit strange, and you can't quite see this as much because you're a thoughtful user. I mean, you can't quite see this as much today as you will shortly. We've done a lot less on the social side than you might expect compared to other social networks, but that's going to be changing relatively shortly. And part of the reason for that is, like, if you want to incentivize thoughtful content consumption and you want to incentivize people interacting in intellectually healthy and productive ways, you really have to rethink every single aspect of how these systems work. And so, one thing we're not going to do is just drop in like a comment system where people can just start talking to each other, because it's like, how many people have learned? It's not a very good way to learn. A bunch of amateurs arguing with each other is very rarely the best use of your time when it comes to an issue that's complicated. But there is something there, as obviously there is value to discussion. Like the discussion we're having now is, I think, valuable in all sorts of ways, I think, for us and hopefully for other people. And so there's something there, and we've got to take our time in figuring out exactly how you rethink those dynamics. And so that's part of actually what we're working on now. I don't think it'll take the form of a traditional commenting system, but there are lots of kinds of interaction that are healthy and positive, and don't necessarily have to distract from you opening up thoughtful to actually spend time on good stuff rather than just watching people fight with each other. And I guess just to, that's sort of where we're going in a certain sense. But where we are now is that the primary social interaction we have today is that we have this concept called thoughtful time, and it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek point that we're making about the time that you spend in thoughtful is time that you should be proud of. It's the screen time that you're proud of, and so we put it front and center because people are proud of it, because it means something. We're not measuring how much time you spend scrolling through thoughtful. We're measuring how much time you actually spend on the content. And that's when you are a platform of enriching content. That's a very meaningful number. And so part of what we show you, we don't do likes, we don't do comments today, but we do show you how much thoughtful time your recommendations and the things you share on Thoughtful create for other people. And that's just, it's a super, super meaningful thing, because instead of sharing something and you see like, oh, this got 8 likes, you can actually see like, oh no, this created like an hour and a half of thoughtful time for somebody. And that's just like, wow. I mean, that makes a real difference in someone's life.
I mean, it's interesting, as like I've actually started tracking physical books that I'm reading in Thoughtful for no other reason than, I mean, there's no reason really to do it other than I can see that number going up, that I just spent, the last 5 hours reading this book, and it's
right.
I'm proud of that. So absolutely.
Right. And it helps build a habit too. I mean, that's a piece of it. It's not just, it keeps you accountable to the fact, because this is a hard thing. It's like, I really think that most of the internet today is it's like sugary cereal in a certain sense. It's like sugary candy. Like, it tastes good, it's interesting, it's super easy to spend all your time, with that stuff. But you're not going to be a happy camper if you do. And so, helping people be accountable to that, build a habit of it, feel good about it. That's part of it.
Well, I want to go back to, I know you said this is some features that are coming up soon, and if you don't want to give away too much of what you're planning, I understand. But I'm curious, because the social part of the internet has always been a very critical part of its success. From way back in the day of the bulletin boards and then discussion forums and whatnot. And they've always been somewhat toxic, as you rightly pointed out, but they've also added a lot of value to people, that interaction. And I've even found myself using Thoughtful, wanting to have interesting, engaging, enriching conversations with people about the content that they may be posting. So yeah. I'm curious how, and again, if you can't give away too much, I understand, but how do you do that? How do you encourage an enriching and a good experience with interactions with other people without getting bogged down in the
well, I'll talk a little bit generally about this. I mean, this is really relevant. It's exactly what Alex Epstein's the co-founder of Thoughtful, exactly what we're working on right after this session. So there are 2 ways that you can go about this kind of thing. And it really is all about it's about incentives and motivation. Part of what you have to understand about the social interaction on the internet is that there are reasons that it becomes toxic. So, for example, within public commenting systems, a lot of the reason that it becomes toxic is that it's performative. It's ostensibly in response maybe to the person who shared the original content, but the fact that it's public means that you're kind of on a stage. And that changes who you're talking to. It's totally different than talking to somebody one-to-one in person about something. And so there are dynamics like that. The fact that it's performative, the fact that you kind of have a built-in audience and you can almost hijack the original content's audience when you share feedback and stuff like that. That's a piece of it. The other piece of it is just when you look at commenting, it's a really broad kind of interaction. And so there are elements of that are really valuable. Like, for example, asking questions and getting answers, or thanking people for sharing something amazing, or sharing, if you have some sort of criticism of it that is thoughtful, like a thoughtful kind of response to something. So there are these subcategories of comments that are, I think one of the most important ones is follow-up content, a suggestion for follow-up content, something that's a pivot, if you will, off of whatever you're looking at, whether it's to emphasize the points that are being made in the content, or to argue against them. Both of those are incredibly valuable, very, very important. And so what we're trying to do is, one, remove the audience piece of that, remove the fact that it's performative, remove the incentives for you to get on a stage and yell things. And on the other hand, more specifically capture the healthy subset of the kinds of interactions that people have. And so that means that, when you see this come out in Thoughtful, it's going to be quite a bit more structured than just sort of just an open text field where anybody could say anything and reply to each other ad nauseum, go back and forth. And so there's a lot more structure to it. And then the audience and the privacy piece is very tricky, but we think we've got an answer to that you'll see eventually.
I like it. So how are you going to take this and scale it up? I mean, so it sounds like a really cool app, but it may only be a small percentage of people that are interested in it now, or do you see this as something that could become $1 billion company? I'm curious about kind of where is it just as a niche app in a crowded marketplace, or is this something that you want to see? I mean, obviously you want to see it become used worldwide, but how do you get there?
Yeah, I mean, we do see it as a multi-billion-dollar market. The problem that we're solving here, I mean, I think it's a really fundamental one to people. I think as people are more introspective over time about their relationship with their devices, the questions and concerns that prompt people to reevaluate how they're using social media, I think we're going to be really well poised to step in there. But I think the right way to think about it is that this is a movement. This is not something where there are 3 billion people asking for a more enriching way to spend their time. You kind of see that in a certain sense with something like digital detox, but that's more like banish the bad rather than we already know what the alternative is. And so a lot of our job is to communicate about that and communicate the fact that there is a better way. There is a better way to spend time on your phone, and there's a better relationship for you to have with the content you're consuming from the internet. And that's, we've got to get out there and talk about that over time. There's actually a lot I can say on this because, part of what we're doing, there's a reason we have such an emphasis today on thoughtful time, on the kind of on building this enriching content consumption habit. But it's certainly not where we're going to end up. I think in the longer term, what this leads to when we have something of a scale and something of a base to build on is a platform that actually helps you figure out what you think about complex and controversial issues. And the market for that is much, much wider. And so it's essentially like, can we be better than Google when it comes to helping you figure out what you think about complex and controversial issues? And that market we already know is very, very big, and there's a lot of reasons you don't start with that. That requires a lot of scale for a whole bunch of reasons, but we think we actually know how to do it. And so as we build this positive movement of spending time in a more enriching way on your phone, that basically translates into us having the audience that's going to be the base of helping us figure out the answers to these questions for ourselves.
So speaking of this business model, how do you make money?
Oh, we don't today. So that's a pretty simple answer. I could say it's probably not going to be advertising. I've observed, over the last 20 years of watching how monetization of software has played out, like what the incentives and disincentives are. And advertising is an amazing business, but it has such serious problems when it comes to the independence of content and the kind of platform that we're trying to build. And so, and on the flip side, there are real problems, I think, and I saw this so strongly at Facebook. You encounter a lot of problems when people don't have to decide how much they value a service they're using. And that's what a payment does. When you have something that's given to you for free for 20 years, you will stop thinking about how valuable it is to you. You'll stop having to make the evaluation of, is this worth it to me? Is this a net positive in my life? Is this on balance good for me? And Facebook has suffered from a lot of that because the product has been free forever. And on one hand, I think if people really were put to that, had that question put to them of like, is this actually good for you? Like, do you want to, would this be worth spending a few dollars on? I mean, a lot of people I think would say yes. But the fact that they never actually have to go through the exercise of doing that, I think in the long term hurts Facebook. And you see a lot of, the trouble that the company is suffering through right now. It comes because people take it for granted. They don't really have a strong understanding of what value and disvalue they get out of the product. And then you compare that to something like Apple, for example, where there's not a single thing that Apple ever does that you don't pay for in one way or another. And they have one of the strongest brands and the best, some of the best brand loyalty on the planet. And it's not like that's not one-to-one, it's not a causal thing necessarily, but the fact that you have to think about how much something is worth to you, and the fact that the people building the product are building it for the people that they know value it, makes a difference. And so we're much more inclined to go in the direction of something pretty straightforward, which is if this thing is valuable to you, you pay for it.
Okay, interesting. I'm thinking you might do like affiliates on marketing, or like since you can buy books through your app.
Yeah.
So I didn't know if you had in a contract already with affiliate program or something, but no, that's not the big money maker.
No.
So let's talk a little bit about how you've been innovating and adapting your app over time. And I know it's still in the early stages, but I'm assuming you use some sort of metrics to track its usage and growth over time. What are you looking at, and how is that informing your decisions?
Yeah, I mean, there are two primary metrics that we care the most about. The first is your traditional retention metric, which, I mean, that's like, I cut my teeth learning everything I could possibly learn about retention at Facebook, which is just it's unbelievably important if you're building a social product, that what percentage of people after they they use it for a little while are still around a month, 2 months, a year from now. So retention is super important. We tracked it very closely. And thoughtful time is actually our own custom metric, which is pretty much the only engagement metric we care about. We don't care about time spent in the app, not on content. We don't care about, we don't have something like likes or anything like that. Thoughtful time is the one consumer, facing metric that we think is very, very meaningful. And that changes over time. It's there's a lot I think I could say about what I learned about the dangers of being too focused and choosing a single metric to optimize for at Facebook. I saw a lot of things go wrong because of that. And so, I like to say that we're more data informed than data driven. We don't make decisions on the basis of numbers. We don't run experiments for the purpose of boosting X, Y, or Z. We don't do that kind of thing. What we do is we use those two metrics primarily to answer questions. We have a lot of pretty long-term and medium-term strategy for what we're doing. We have a pretty strong idea of how to go about doing it. Part of that comes because Alex and I are incredibly exhaustive about thinking through and empathizing with users, and understanding what the problems that they're facing are. That's so much of why we're actually different than other platforms like Parler and Gab. It's like we have a very strong understanding of that. This is we're not just trying to solve some political issue. We actually care about how this fits into people's lives, and so we spend a lot of time thinking from that perspective. And then we measure the results, but we do with something like thoughtful time and retention. But we very rarely make decisions on the basis of it. It's mostly just a report card, if you will.
Let's switch gears and talk a little bit more technical. How is Thought? I mean, I know right now it's currently only available on iOS. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
And I know you have a web app or web plugin, or a browser plugin. Let's get more precise. But what technologies are you using to build Thoughtful and run the technology?
Yeah, so I mean, this on each. So we have iOS. We have a pretty amazing iOS app, which is a lot of the app is quite custom. It's built on top of UIKit and sort of Apple's technologies and things like that. But even the basic UI structure is actually a custom stack navigation system, and so it looks and feels a little bit different than most iOS apps. It's much more gestural. And so there's a whole bunch of technology that went into that, which comes from my days back on paper. A lot of the ideas that we had experimented a lot with. What is the best way to interact with a social platform on a phone? where the primary interface is your finger and it's not sort of a back button or a mouse or a keyboard. And so, Thoughtful really embraces that kind of gestural model, allowing you to go really deep, through the sort of web of content and then jump right back to, you can actually pull down and see the whole history of where you've been. And you may not have even seen some of these features but it's really built from the ground up to allow you to sort of explore the web of content without having to go back all the way to get back to your home screen. On the back end, there's a whole bunch, potentially more interesting answers. So everything today, or we use Firebase services for database, for authentication. I will, and then we also use Google Cloud for hosting essentially the backend, which is all written, it's all written in TypeScript, it's custom. We don't use sort of any off the shelf stuff for anything that happens to generate feeds and manage queue and do notifications. That's all custom stuff that's hosted on Google Cloud. The one thing I will say about this is that, and this is important for anybody else who wants to build a social platform today, it particularly in the realm of potentially dealing with controversial issues, which is sort of where you're going if you're going to help people think through complex and controversial issues. It's very intentional that we do not actually host content ourselves today. And so everything in Thoughtful is kind of an aggregator, right? It's you're using links to things that are on YouTube. The podcasts themselves are hosted on different platforms. And so Thoughtful is an aggregator in the sense that it's directing your attention to all of these different sources, but we don't actually host any content ourselves today. And that's by design. If we were to move into that realm with the kind of content policy we have and the incredible deference that we give to users in exercising their discretion about what they think is thoughtful, not sort of going along with Facebook or Amazon's content policies, which prohibit all sorts of controversy these days, we'd have to have very independent infrastructure. And that's something that we will move into over time, and moving away from being hosted by Google and using Google services for things like that, just because that independence is going to become important to us over time. But that's the kind of thing that's very expensive, very complicated to do that. And so you kind of need scale and resources to do it. And so that's part of the strategy here, is that we'll be moving off of the Google Firebase services over time.
Okay. So using Google and AWS.
Partially, yeah.
Partially, yeah, right. Okay. So now, and I've just recently kind of started using the Explore button on Thoughtful. I'm assuming there's some sort of algorithm that helps recommend things. How does that work, and how are you thinking through that? Because that's part of one of the exciting things I like in life is finding other great content that kind of serendipitous. Hey, I never even realized that was out there.
And so basically, we have a system on the back end called judgment coefficient. I've actually never talked about this publicly, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit. And so, so we have a system called judgment coefficient, and it's essentially, between any two users in Thoughtful, on the basis of what they actually spend thoughtful time on and the people that they follow and regard. On Thoughtful, the people you follow are generally people you regard as thoughtful. They're people that you think are going to be sources of thoughtful content. And it's sort of a hybrid of combining the signal from the overlap between a given person and who they follow and who you follow, mixed with the specific pieces of content that you've both interacted with, and looking at what you actually find thoughtful. And so we basically combine those in a sort of weighted fashion to form something that we call a judgment coefficient, which is essentially a rating of how close we think your judgment might be to another person. And then we, as content comes across the system, we are use that essentially to rank content today. And there's a whole bunch of ways that's going to evolve over the future. But the baseline principle is that we want to show you the things that we think people who are going to have the closest judgment to your own. not necessarily things that are popular. So that's a really big gap. And so there's no part of this that actually puts an emphasis on popularity or how much something gets in terms of content. And the other piece of it is that in terms of, where you are in the network, we basically look out a couple orders, if you will, from the people that you follow to surface content and explore. And so there's no possibility for somebody who's totally disconnected from you in terms of who you follow and who they follow on. There's no possibility for completely disconnected content to just show up and explore, but it will show a couple orders out from where you are in terms of the overall following networks. And so that's part of one of the unique dynamics that creates, is that because we don't have this emphasis on popularity, even somebody who has just one follower on Thoughtful, they actually show up in quite a few people's Explore feeds. And so, there's this phenomenon where people, really just started on Thoughtful and share something. You can create actually unbelievable amount of Thoughtful time by sharing things even without having a large follow. And so it's part of the dynamic in there as well.
Interesting. That is fascinating. I like that. I'll have to think more about that. And that kind of follows up with my, and I think we've done enough comparisons with Facebook, so I won't talk about their algorithm. And you've already kind of discussed that, I think, enough. But I like this approach. It's very interesting. Focusing on the individuals and what they actually spend time doing, and doing thoughtful content on. What type of, or how might this be of use in more of an educational experience? Because I was thinking, especially like in college, because as a professor, that's my primary domain. But is this something that you could see working within in a college environment? And if so, how?
I mean, I really hope so. I mean, I could talk from my experience about this in college. When I came to college, I had this idea that it was going to be, like a lyceum in a certain sense. Like it was going to be this unbelievable, healthy clash of ideas, and that this was really a time to focus on the big questions in life, and to actually spend time chewing on them with who were also thinking about them, and with professors who had more mature and considered perspectives on things like that. And so and I was disappointed to find that was relatively little of what my college experience was, and I don't think that's particular to the school I went to or anything like that. But those issues are, and that is the time for people to be thinking about the big ideas in life, to be thinking about what their philosophical perspective is, to be thinking about how all of it fits together, all the pieces of life together. I think less so on politics and news and things like that. And those things they're important to the extent that they change, who you are and what you do. But it's just people spend way too much time in that kind of content. So, the way I would use Thoughtful, if I had Thoughtful in college today, is I would build that kind of lyceum for myself in Thoughtful. I think I would build a curriculum of thinking about the big ideas, following, people are philosophers and scientists and entrepreneurs and the people who are the best in the world in their field, and build a curriculum of actually really spending time on that kind of content. I think Thoughtful could be incredibly helpful with that, because you don't have to do it as the class. You could do it between your classes. You could do it in your downtime. You could do it, while you're eating meals. I mean, that's actually one of my biggest uses for Thoughtful is, when I eat lunch every day, I'm using Thoughtful, is to replace people, because most people, if you're eating lunch by yourself, you're going to just be scrolling on your phone. Well, such a common thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would use it that way. I mean, I would really build an environment where you can spend time on the big ideas, and you will. It doesn't take long when you spend time on Thoughtful for you to encounter a lot of that stuff. And part is because, we have this everything on Thoughtful. The atomic unit of content on Thoughtful is a recommendation, right? It's not a post. It's not a link. It's a recommendation. It's a positive recommendation. It's a thing that something is good. This is not a place where people go to talk about why something is terrible or why, it's why this take is bad. It's a positive recommendation. And the extreme form of that is something that we call top recommendations. And so on everybody's profile, they can share the kind of content that that influence their perspective on the major issues that they care about. They can share the stuff that really, in a certain sense, made them who they are. And that content is, you won't find that anywhere else. Like you have to have one-on-one conversations, short of thoughtful, for you to actually get that out of people. And it's an amazing source for different perspectives on those big ideas that really do matter. And that's, to me, I think that's what college should be all about.
Yeah. And as a professor, I was wondering too, like how I could, I suppose I could just create a profile, put those top recommendations and say, hey, students, check this out. And give them ideas of what they can read to topics.
Yeah. I think it's dry. Yeah.
All right. So, all right, I want to switch gears a little bit again and get a little bit more personal, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So I was on your website and I saw, yeah, you're like, oh my God, yes, I'm the one. No. What fascinated me was that you wrote down at 14 years old, you decided your purpose in life. And it was to amplify human capability and raise standards. And it struck me as that's unusual for a 14-year-old to have that much clarity, which is awesome. Like, I can't give you enough props for that. But what led you to that realization?
There's a long story here. I think the short version is, it had a pretty transformative moment when I was a kid where I realized that I learned, and you're not going to like this as a professor, I learned more when I was homesick than when I went to school. And that was when I actually put it in those terms for myself. It really changed something about me, because I realized, like, okay, I really need to figure out my own curriculum in a certain sense, because what I'm getting from school is pulling me down. That's kind of it's not a very humble thing for me to say right now, but I think it's true, and that's how I felt. And so, in a certain sense, it became my goal at that point. And this is probably when I was about 13, about a year before I came to this purpose stuff. It's my goal at that point to figure out how to spend as much of my time following my own nose versus following, what the curriculums at school and things like that. And that led me down this path of, I was essentially my own version of thoughtful, I guess, and back then. And so I spent a lot of time on the internet, watching videos of people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, and learning about what made them who they are, and how they thought about the work that they did, history. I was always interested in technology and things. I had always been building websites and things like that. And so I spent a lot of time on that kind of content, which was pretty philosophical, pretty intellectual, certainly for a kid. And that combined with this, when I realized that I learned more I started doing more on my own. I started, trying to figure out, how do I actually make money so that nobody can tell me how I spend my time? Because that's the ultimate thing. It's like, you have to go to college in order to pay you. And then it's really, at the end of the day, for me, the motive was, if I'm fully financially independent, nobody can tell me how to spend my time, and I can follow in curiosity, and I know everything. That's, for me, that was the ultimate thing when I was a kid. And so what it became was that I developed this incredible appreciation for entrepreneurs and people who built tools. And that, a lot of that came from, Steve Jobs thinking about how, if you I don't remember the exact quote, but it's something to be on the order of, your life will never be the same when you realize that everything that you call life is made by people who are no smarter than you, that you can change it, you can influence it, that you can build your own things that other people use, and that combined with the thing that Steve had been building, Steve Jobs had been building, was what he called the bicycle for the mind. That's what the computer was. It was an incredible tool that totally changed our ability as human beings to think and to do things with our thoughts. And so that's the amplifying capability part of it. I've always been totally fascinated with that, and I view the role of the mind and our ability to use reason as a defining thing that makes human beings, and it's just unbelievably if you can improve that by 1%, you can amplify an aspect of what it means to be a thinking human being by even 1%. You absolutely change the world. And so that's the kind of thing I've always been interested in. The raising standards piece of it, I can talk about it if you're interested, but the very short version is this other perspective that I came to have very, very early on, is that there's nothing inevitable the way we live. There's nothing necessary about the fact that we don't live in caves right now. We could, that could be the standard of life, but people are more ambitious than that, and things improve over time because people are not satisfied with the status quo, and they push. And essentially, all of human evolution and the change in the way we live from caves to where we are today is not at all necessary, not strictly necessary. It's a good thing, but that's up to each of us. And so it's a matter of standards. We're used to it today, which is why it's what we call our standard of living. But there's nothing immutable about that. You can have much higher standards. You can have much higher standards. And so that's always a lens that I find very helpful to think about, to really scrutinize the way we live and what aspects of it can be better, because there's nothing set in stone about any of it. It's the two pieces.
Yeah. Fascinating. So, I can see where that purpose, especially with your current company, Thoughtful, how did that guide you in your pursuit of Facebook and starting to work there?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. There's sort of two pieces to this. The first, as a framework, every 6 months or so, I take an entire day off, and I go on a very long walk where I basically, from scratch, think through, given what I know about the world today, given what I know about what I like, don't like, given the circumstances that I'm in, what is the best way for me to amplify human capability and raise standards? I do this every 6 months, and I drive the whole thing. And most of the time, the answer is the same thing. It's to do what you're doing now. It's in the case when I was at Facebook for 7 years, the answer was to keep working on what I'm on and keep pushing there. But eventually, the answer changes, and that to me that's the key of it's why I left Facebook. It's why I joined Facebook, is the answer to that thing changed. And so it's been very helpful for me to do that. And in Facebook's case specifically, I recognize the role that information, the velocity with which information moves around the world matters. This is, if you look back through history, this is one of the things I think a few other people at Facebook used to like to think about. If you look back through history of technology, you look at things like, from the telephone to the radio to email to, if you can go earlier than that, the printing press. These are some of the most significant technologies to ever come to be. And the thing that they have in common is that they transformed, accelerated the velocity with which information could get from one person's head to the world. And I was fascinated by that, and I saw Facebook as the next step in that. In the early days, that's really how I conceived. I wanted it to be the platform for ideas. And in the early days of Facebook, a lot of people at Facebook thought it that way. I know Mark Zuckerberg thought about it. He wasn't as focused on it as I was, but he very much cared about that as well. And so that's why I joined in the first place, because I saw it as this sort of step change in the velocity of information moving around the world.
I love it. So what advice would you give someone interested in pursuing a career in tech?
Uh, boy. I mean, I think the real fundamental is to focus on actual problems. There's particularly today, there's a lot of interest in crypto and Web3 and AI. These are all fancy buzzwords, and I'm not going to comment on the merits or lack of merits on any of them. But technology doesn't change the world on its own. I mean, you have to focus on actually solving problems that real people care about, that matter in their lives, and that sounds simple, but it's really, really hard. It takes a lot of perspective to do that. And so, my biggest advice is go deep on the tech, hone your skill on that kind of stuff, but you need to develop the ability to zoom out and have a perspective on what's happening in the world and in people's lives, and what aspect of it fascinates you that you think you can contribute to and actually make better. And that's the stuff that keeps you going, because the technologies come and go, and I think they're a means to an end. But the fundamental problems, the fundamental insights about the problems we have and the opportunities we have as human beings, that's the stuff that really ends up mattering and making your work so meaningful. So I don't forget that part of it.
Yeah, brilliant. I like it, Brian. Well, Brian, I think that about wraps up all the questions I had for you. By chance, do you have any for me?
I mean, I have a lot I'd like to add thoughtful, but I don't know if I should do that on the air here.
That's okay. No, I appreciate it. So with that, then I think we will wrap up this conversation. I love this conversation. It was great, and you really, to be honest, you wowed me with some of these answers. So thank you, and I am glad I have picked up Thoughtful and hope to continue using it. So thanks again for sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks so much, and to time well spent.
Appreciate it.
Take care.